Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Winecast. My recent cast on Australian wine inspired me to try the same type of cast for something a little closer to home, the U.S. After all, like Australia, the U.S. is a huge country and a major player in the world wine market, known for wines from various regions within it, each that could easily do with a dedicated future cast. So, as with Australia, this cast will be about getting you some information about the history, grapes, law, and wine culture that each of these American regions share, so we won't have to go over them again in each future cast. Unlike in other parts of the New World, colonists from Europe found native species of grapes growing in North America. These species were not Vitis vinifera, though, the species cultivated in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East to make wine, but instead more than a dozen local species, the six most important of which in terms of being able to make drinkable wine, being Vitis labrusca, aestivalis, rotundifolia, riparia, rupestris, and mustangensis, with vinifera, the European wine grape, arriving on both coasts of what would later become the United States, with colonists primarily from Britain on the east coast and from Spain on the west coast. Making wine from vinifera grapes, though, turned out to be a bit of a struggle, at least on the east coast, where the extremely humid climate promoted rot and other diseases among the vines, and where the vines were vulnerable to pests like phylloxera that the native vines had developed a resistance to, dooming any effort to make vinifera-based wines. The climate on the west coast was much more like southern Europe, and there were no natural grapevine predators there either, meaning that settlers could make vinifera wines from the start, but the main grape Spanish settlers brought with them was Baies, the same grape that they brought with them to Chile and other parts of their empire, and that ended up making pretty uninspired and unexciting communion wine. Back on the east coast, it did occur to British and other settlers to make wine from the local grapes, but these grapes had a suite of flavors that varied from species to species, but were all in some ways more or less unappetizing to European palates. Notably, many of them carried musky aromas and flavors that, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, ended up being described as foxy, whatever that means, and seemed to have been an acquired taste. Over time, settlers began breeding the local species and vinifera from Europe to create hybrids that had better flavor and aroma profiles than the native grapes and that could stand the local climate and pests better than vinifera. They had some success with these hybrids, and quite a few of them are still a popular winemaking option on the east coast of the United States. And they were even part of an early solution to the problem of phylloxera when that plague made its way to Europe. But the judgment of most was that they never could match the complexity and quality of vinifera. Incidentally, when discussing new grapes produced by breeding, you'll hear a couple of terms come up that have very particular meanings, so it's worth clarifying them. If someone refers to a cross, then they're talking about an intraspecific breeding, or a breeding between two members of the same species. But if they mention a hybrid, then the breeding was interspecific, or between two different species. So when Syrah and Peloursin, for example, got together in the south of France a century and a half or so ago and had a love child, the result, Durif/Petit Syrah, is called a cross because both Syrah and Peloursin are members of the same species, in this case Vitis vinifera. But when the vinifera grape Fol Blanche was bred, perhaps accidentally, with a member of the Vitis riparia species, the resulting grape, Baco Noir, is called a hybrid because of its multi-species parentage. Wine is still made in the United States from native grape species, with the most prominent examples being Concord and Niagara from the Labrusca species, that are both very important to the New York State wine industry, with Concord providing the signature grape flavor in many jams, candies, and sodas produced in the United States. The very first wine in what would become the U.S. was made in the early 1560s by French Huguenot settlers near what's now St. Augustine, Florida, from Scuppernong grapes, and you can still find a fair amount of wine made from that grape today. And you won't have any trouble whatsoever finding Norton grapes if you visit Missouri. It's the hybrids, though, that get all of the respect, at least relatively speaking, and you'll see bottlings of these all over the eastern seaboard and Midwest of the United States, with the ones I've listed here being some of the most common examples. So I've been covering a lot of American wine history really fast, but there's one thing that you can't omit when talking about American wine, and that's Prohibition. Though the form of it that's most well known is national prohibition involving the entire country, individual counties and municipalities in the U.S. were passing so-called local options that allowed them to ban the sale of various kinds of alcohol, usually at least distilled liquor and often wine and beer as well. In 1851, Maine became the first state to go dry, passing a law banning the sale of all alcoholic beverages, and within 4 years, Maine was joined by 12 other states that had also gone dry. Prohibition at the national level began on January 17, 1920, a year after the passage of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and lasted until December 5, 1933, when it was repealed by the 21st Amendment. Prohibition and its aftermath are worthy of a full winecast, but for now, suffice it to say that the damage done to quality wine production and the culture of wine consumption in the U.S. was enormous, with only a small number of wineries managing to survive those awful 13 years, usually by selling grapes for table consumption or by providing grapes for individuals and organizations taking advantage of several exemptions for the medicinal and sacramental production of wine, or of a provision that allowed for home winemakers to make up to 200 gallons per year of, quote, non-intoxicating cider and fruit juice, unquote, that usually ended up being surprisingly intoxicating. Part of what delayed recovery was the fact that the 21st Amendment that ended national prohibition with its first sentence didn't leave well enough alone and added a second sentence saying that transporting or importing alcohol into any state or other part of the U.S. would still be illegal if it went against the laws of that state. So states still had the right to remain dry, and several states did so, with Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Texas staying dry after Prohibition, and though most of them repealed a few years later, Mississippi didn't until 1966. The states that didn't enact statewide bans on alcohol often gave counties and cities the option of doing so, and even today, though most of the U.S. counties pictured in blue are wet and allow the sale of alcoholic beverages, many are dry, pictured in red, and ban those sales, while a large number are moist or damp. I'm not kidding, that's actually what they're called, and either have some wet municipalities in an otherwise dry county or vice versa. And even states with no dry or moist counties can and do have other laws that restrict the sale of alcohol, like laws that prohibit sales on Sundays or before a certain time of the day on Sunday, or, as pictured on this map, that don't allow wine to be sold in grocery stores but require it to be purchased in only pharmacies or liquor stores. And that's just the tip of the strange wine and liquor law iceberg, with the U.S. having a complex set of laws governing how wine can be sold and distributed throughout the country that really deserves its own cast. But it wasn't just legal issues that made recovery so difficult. It was also an issue of wine culture, with, for reasons that are still not well understood, Americans emerging from Prohibition with a serious sweet tooth for their booze. Before Prohibition, dry wine outsold sweet wine in the U.S. by a margin of 3-1. But after Prohibition, still dry wine wouldn't outsell sweet fortified wine until, wait for it, 1968. Yep, 1968. So producers of quality dry wine definitely had their work cut out for them. In spite of all that, things have turned around for the U.S., and the United States is currently one of the biggest players in the wine world. In 2016, the U.S. was the fourth largest producer of wine in the world, following Italy, France, and Spain. That same year, the U.S. was the sixth largest exporter of wine, trailing just behind Australia in terms of dollar value of exports, and with 90% of those exports coming from California. And it was also the largest importer of wine that year. In terms of exports, the U.S.'s largest market is the EU, including Great Britain, followed by our friendly neighbor to the north, Canada. And about 30% of U.S. wine sales are for imported wines, and that number appears to be rising. California, as we'll see in a minute, is the U.S.'s biggest wine-producing state by a very large margin. And that's not a big surprise if you remember California's favorable climate and lack of natural pests. So even though the first commercial winery in California wasn't founded until 1857, much later than wineries back east, the industry quickly became the most significant in America, and even the twin plagues of phylloxera a few decades later and Prohibition couldn't knock it from its perch. So, speaking of significant wine-producing states, where is all of this wine coming from? Well, that's actually a bit of a complicated question. It's common in wine circles to hear that California produces around 90% of U.S. wine, but that number needs a closer look. See, the best source for numbers for wine production in a given year, let's take 2016 as our example, is the TTB, or Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, that oversees wine regulation in the United States. And according to them, California produces a still impressive 85% of American wine, with Washington State, the home of this cast, clocking in at a distant second with 5% production, followed by New York State with 3.5% production, with Pennsylvania and Oregon each contributing about 1.5%, and the rest of the states, since grape wine is produced in every state in the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, taking up the modest slack. So what could be complicated about that? Case closed, right? Well, what's complicated is that when it comes to the statistics that the TTB releases, the TTB is clear in its own literature that it defines wine as, quote, every class and type of product produced on a bonded wine premises from grapes, other fruit, including berries, or other suitable agricultural products, close quote. In other words, wine to the TTB means alcoholic beverages made not just from vinifera, but also from native and hybrid grapes and fruit all the way from raspberries to kumquats. That's significant because some U.S. states, like Pennsylvania, have a relatively high volume of production of fruit and non-vinifera wines compared to other states like Oregon that, though they do produce fruit wines, have a larger percentage of their production devoted to vinifera. So if only grape wines and not fruit wines were considered, then the West Coast states of California, Washington, and Oregon would take a bigger share. And if only vinifera wines were considered, then that share would get even larger, since wines made from hybrids and native grapes are very rare in those states, but fairly common in New York, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. So the 90% figure, provided you're just thinking of vinifera, might not be far off. New York and Pennsylvania do grow vinifera, with New York especially getting some serious praise lately for its vinifera wines. And in addition to these two, there are small but commercially significant plantings of Vitis vinifera in Virginia, Texas, Arizona, and Idaho, with the grape wine industries of other states being either very tiny or overwhelmingly focused on native grapes and hybrids. How are wines made from these grapes labeled? Unlike the elegant commitment to a single percentage followed by some countries like Australia, the U.S. has a variety of percentages for various categories. If a place of origin for a wine is given as the entire United States, or a state or county within the U.S., then 75% of the grapes in that wine must have come from the named location. If the place of origin is an American viticultural area, or AVA, then 85% of the grapes must have come from there, and if the location is a named vineyard, then that number goes up to 95%. For more information on American viticultural areas and some exceptions to these general rules, please see my cast on AVAs. If a named varietal appears on the label, then 75% of the wine in the bottle must be from the named varietal, unless the varietal is a member of the Vitis labrusca family, like Concord or Niagara, in which case it only needs to be 51% of what's in the bottle. If two or more varietals are used and the producer wants to identify one of them, then she must identify all of them and give the percentages of each in the bottle. If a vintage date appears on the label and the wine has a state or county place of origin, then 85% of the wine in the bottle must be from the named vintage. But if the place of origin is an AVA, then the requirement goes up to 95%. So what are the big grapes when it comes to American wine? There are literally hundreds of varietals planted in the U.S., and based on numbers for 2010, in terms of acres under vine, Chardonnay leads that pack, followed by Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Zinfandel, Pinot Noir, Colombar, that often appears in inexpensive large format wines, Syrah, Concord, the only native non-vinifera grape in the top 10, Sauvignon Blanc, and Pinot Gris. Riesling comes in at number 11, and a bit farther down the line is Durif Petit Syrah, with the U.S. being one of the countries with the largest plantings of this grape in the world. Style-wise, in the U.S., varietals are king, with tons and tons of American wines bearing the name of one grape only, even if sometimes only 75% of the wine is that grape. There certainly are lots of blends out there, though, with red blends being especially popular. Sparklers are a big deal too, with California, no surprise, leading the way there, and with a number of French and Spanish sparkling producers from Champagne, the cava production regions of Spain, and elsewhere having production houses in California and selling brands made from local grapes. Wines made from native and hybrid grapes are almost unknown on the west coast of the United States, but they're very popular on the eastern seaboard and in the south. They get a lot of grief from vinifera drinkers, and the truth is I haven't sampled enough to make a fair judgment. But on a trip to Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, I had some wines made from Chancellor and Chambourcin, and thought they were actually pretty solid. Good luck finding them, though, if you don't live in the areas where they're produced. Finally, America hasn't completely recovered from its post-prohibition sweet tooth, and a lot of still wines, both white, red, and rosé, that are made in America carry noticeable sweetness, and calling some of them off-dry would be an understatement. Every year, around 20 million cases of very sweet white Zinfandel from various producers is sold in the U.S., and for comparison's sake, the entire state of Washington usually only produces around 17.5 million cases of wine total. And there's a growing trend in sweet red wine blends and sweet whites, especially Chardonnays. For some tips on identifying these wines before you buy them or don't buy them, see my cast on Shelf Talkers. Thanks for joining me for another Winecast. I hope you finish this cast with an overall framework for American wine that will either help you enjoy it more or make some sense of it if you're new to it. A cast like this can only begin to tell the story of wine in the U.S., and I hope to flesh that story out with additional casts on the full impact of Prohibition, on American wine culture and law, and with individual casts on the major wine-producing states. If this cast was helpful and enjoyable, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks as always to all of my viewers for taking the time to watch, comment, ask questions, and make requests. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.